The reality for principals is that when you are working in the area of reconciliation, none of this is about feeling bad or doing the right thing. This is an employability issue. This is about committing your school to an engagement with the local community in much the same way that we think about creating people who are employable. And that's why we have to think about Indigenous education as an employability issue, because that means that every single person you create, I don't care if it's an auto mechanic, I don't care if it's a stay-at-home parent, I don't care if it's a person who goes on to university or college, every single person's going to have to work effectively with Indigenous people.
You've been listening to Niigaan Sinclair, an Anishinaabe writer, editor, activist, and head of the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of your hosts for Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. Now, are territorial acknowledgements becoming mere formalities in your school? That's one of the things that we address with our guest, Niigaan Sinclair. And with him, we talk about the immense role that principals play in advocating for systemic reform in Indigenous education, going beyond the token, gestures, and truly preparing students to work effectively in a diverse and inclusive Canada.
This podcast is brought to you by the word territory, from the Latin terra, meaning land or earth. Territory has come to mean not only the land, but also the areas under a specific governing body's control. While territory describes what animals claim or defend in an area, human behavior is similar, as it also means defending space for survival and resources.
Check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for practical restorative resources to help build relationships and use circles in particular to build communities in schools, in classrooms, and in staff rooms. Let's jump into this ongoing conversation with your hosts, Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan.
You mentioned something about the land acknowledgements that we read every day. And there was an article in the Ottawa Citizen talking about, is the land acknowledgement just simply white noise? Is it doing any good anymore that we read the land acknowledgement?
Your question is about territorial acknowledgements. First off, I would never call it a land acknowledgement because it's not about land. Land actually is doing just fine, thanks. And like land, when we acknowledge the land, should we be acknowledging what all the things the land gives to us? Absolutely. But the problem isn't our conflict. Yes, it is. The problem is the conflict with the land that we have, because that's the environmental crisis. But the environmental crisis only comes from our conflict amongst ourselves as human beings. So what we're talking about is territory. We're talking about the ways that we view land. And when we say a territorial acknowledgement, what we're talking about is the people we have been taught not to see. And what I mean by that is when we say, oh, we're sharing territory with these nations, it's because we've been taught not to see them, that they don't matter. We've been taught that only Canada and English and French people matter. So we do that every day. It's the national anthem. We sing it in French. We sing it in English. We talk about the monarch. We even talk about Quebec. We never talk about Anishinaabe Nation or Cree Nations or Algonquin Nations or Haudenosaunee or the Six Nations. The only ever time we talk about it is these little things we do at the start of meetings where we may just gesture and go, hey, everybody, do you know that we're sharing territories with Indigenous peoples? Anyways, back to our competitive capitalist individual project here. Screw those people, by the way. And I know we just said we acknowledge them, but screw them, because they're in the way of progress and they're going to bring their Indigenous rights and stop our pipelines. Notice how that works. So the territorial acknowledgement must connect with everything you do afterwards. And here's how you start with that. Like, you stop reading the darn thing. You say, and this is not memorizing it either. You don't memorize it. You say from your heart, this is what it means for me to be a part of this territory in collaboration with these Indigenous nations. And absolutely, here's how you connect with the water, with the bears, with the trees, with the sun, with the moon. And the reason that you do that is because, A, you're talking about the people you haven't seen before, but you're also acknowledging that the land is really the reason that we're here. The land is the reason that we have food to eat and air to breathe and water to drink. Because if we didn't have any of those things, then it doesn't matter if you and I get along. It just doesn't matter. The territorial acknowledgement is meant to be a launching pad to the meeting. It's meant to be fully and absolutely integrated, not some random arbitrary frankly useless and ornamental thing that you do at the start. It's meant, but if you do it, I don't want you to do it, because you might as well just be honest with the project that you're doing, which is to destroy relationships, the land, create competitiveness, leave people behind, because that's what we do in the rest of our day by teaching kids about collecting credits, only worry about yourself, just sit in a row and in a concrete box away from the land. Do we learn other important things? Of course we do. Of course we learn important things. I'm not saying that's the only thing we do, but that's the values that we hold up and that are the most valuable, things that we reward people for. So what we want to do is we want to then change some conversation, say, what does it mean for us all to be part of this community, and how do we share, and how do we collaborate? How do we see each other as valuable and worthy? Or this thing that we wear in orange shirts, which is how do we make sure every child matters? Really, like actually, instead of just going, oh, well, every child matters, but anyways, only some children matter.
There's a whole lot there. I wonder, when you talk about the land and territory, how can a sense of the land and territory that a school is on help a principal and be part of the reconciliation work that a principal does?
That's a great question. I think here's the thing about reconciliation, and it's never going to look the same in BC, in Northwest Territories, and in Ontario or Quebec or Maritimes. One of my very privileged roles in my life is that I get to travel everywhere, and I work with teachers in coast to coast. I just was in Vancouver literally a week ago. I was in Ontario yesterday, and for Orange Shirt Day. I just got booked this morning to go back to Yellowknife for like my 7th time, work with teachers there. And I was in Whitehorse, which is the real privilege. My dream was to go to Whitehorse, and then eventually Iqaluit. Those are my dreams. I've never been to Iqaluit, but I've been everywhere else. And the one thing I can tell you is that reconciliation never looks the same. It's all about locality and the relationships within that locality, because it necessarily involves Indigenous peoples and Canadians and newcomers sitting together in a circle, co-leading, sharing, making sure that their kids are learning from each other, and that it's learning from elders as much as learning from Canadians and people who have really valuable opinions like teachers. But the bottom line of it is, in every reconciliation project, it's built in relationships with Indigenous peoples who are from that area, who are living in that area, who are working, who have been birthed in that area. And so that's the one criteria that's always. And so I have my students at university. I teach a mandatory class for all students in the university. They have to take Indigenous studies as a part of their future life as a police officer, doctor, nurse, teacher. Like every student at the University of Manitoba who's going in humanities has to take Indigenous studies. And now at the University of Winnipeg, every single program, but at the University of Manitoba, just certain faculties. And what does that really mean? What that means is that the most employable skill going forward in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Northwestern Ontario, I'll add you in too, but soon enough, Alberta, BC, and eventually Ontario will be working effectively with Indigenous people. We already see that in the North. Like you could not in any way have a job in the North or Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Northwestern Ontario without having competency working with Indigenous peoples. If you work on a train, you're going to work on Indigenous lands. If you're going to work with any resource at all, oil, gas, shale, lithium, diamonds, anything, it's going to involve Indigenous lands and resources and the constitutional recognition of Indigenous rights. If you're going to be a teacher, dentist, business owner, carpenter, you're going to need to work effectively with Indigenous peoples. And the reality for principals is that when you are working in the area of reconciliation, none of this is about feeling bad or doing the right thing. This is an employability issue. This is about committing your school to an engagement with the local community in much the same way that we think about creating people who are employable. And that's why we have to think about Indigenous education as an employability issue, because that means that every single person you create, I don't care if it's an auto mechanic, I don't care if it's a stay-at-home parent, I don't care if it's a person who goes on to university or college, every single person's going to have to work effectively with Indigenous people, whether as a client, as a customer, as sitting on the bus, maybe be married to. And so our job as educational leaders is to create employable Canadians or good citizenship Canadians. Isn't that our job? And that naturally begins at chapter 1 of the country, which is Indigenous people. And chapter 2 is English, French, Confederation, talking about the Canada's Constitution. And we have to treat Indigenous education like we do math. We could easily cut an Indigenous education program, because I see it all the time. Teachers go, or principals go, oh, we don't have money for that next year, or oh, we don't have that land program that we were doing that was a huge part of our Indigenous education. We don't got space for that. We got to do more math. If that same principal turned to parents or their own school district or the teachers and said, you know what, guys, math is too much. We're not going to do any math next year. There's no math. We're cutting it. You would be fired within about 50 minutes. Like you would never last. The people would say, no, math is the most essential part of the school, or science or social studies or English language arts. But we cut Indigenous education all the time. Like we say, oh, it doesn't really matter. But yet that's one of the most employable issues going forward. I would say it's as employable as math.
I really like the context that you're setting it in, and
Yes.
also how you're framing it in a way that people will actually sit up and listen. That I think is a very helpful way of framing it as well.
The map behind me, I don't know if you can see the map behind
Yes,
me.
I can. Yeah.
I don't know if your podcast actually includes a video element. So
It does. Yes.
this map behind me is a wonderful map. It's a compilation by the University of Maine of Canada in Indigenous names. So all the Indigenous names of rivers, territories, places, those are all on that map. So it's Canada remapped. There's no English words on that entire map. Most of it is syllabics in traditional Indigenous languages, but not all Indigenous languages have the syllabics that you would recognize and understand. Anyways, my point is that we have to think of the places that we live meaningfully and inclusively. We can't just pretend like we're inclusive. And it's amazing to me how many schools have a mantra. They're like, everybody matters here, or believe in yourself and you can do anything you want, or we all are important here. And then they just don't act that way in any way. They put all the Indigenous kids in the remedial program. They take all the Indigenous languages and go, English and French are the only ones that matter here. We fly flags where we celebrate every day a certain story of Canada, but certainly not other stories that are on the exact same territory and are the reason Canada exists. And we, as a set of educational leaders, and I was part of the education system too, we reify these narratives in everything that we do, and especially the micro things we do. And so our job is to analyze everything around us and rename things, rethink about them, relook at them. And we'll realize that Canada is an amazing place, not despite Indigenous peoples, but because of Indigenous peoples. In fact, every inch, every penny, every single segment of the country is created by Indigenous peoples. It was Indigenous peoples who created democracy, healthcare, freedom. Europeans had very little to do with any of that. They came and inherited those things from Indigenous peoples. Europeans were xenophobic people who were based in a system that was only based in a very 1% English, the king and the pope. And they generally there was definitely no freedom of speech. There was definitely no democracy. And the people didn't carry around a copy of Plato's Republic and suddenly rediscover it in North America. We go, oh, let's make democracy. No, they saw Indigenous peoples in the ways we lived, the ways that we operated, the ways that we ran this place. For hundreds of years, they were observers and then went, that's how we're going to build this place. And they started that because of Indigenous principles, and Europeans, English and French people had important things to say along the way. And then we created Canada. We created Canada's economy, still doing it on Indigenous lands and resources, still continuing to try to engage this project together. And here's my point out of all of this is that as a leader, you can either recreate that story, add that story, recreate your school that you live based on that story, or you can ignore it, which would mean that you are ignoring the very foundation of Canada, the very foundation of what it means to be Canadian. And I would say not teaching Canadians how to be Canadian.
As you heard in this podcast, principals are essential advocates for systemic changes in Indigenous education. Your actions and decisions as a principal and your willingness to challenge the status quo are critical to creating an inclusive school environment that supports reconciliation beyond surface level commitments. Find out more about our work, particularly with circles that promote reconciliation, at www.restorative.ca. This is part 2 of 4, and our next episode talks about how schools are actually set up for restorative ways of repairing harm, particularly with Indigenous communities.